The core gameplay of Deadlink is really good. It just feels fun and satisfying to play. The other elements, though, surrounding that core gameplay don't hit quite as well, so let's get into it. Deadlink is an FPS roguelite set in a cyberpunk world where you're part of an unofficial government agency doing simulations to take down evil corporations. You can play as 4 different classes, each with their own 2 class abilities and primary weapon. While there are class-specific secondary weapons as well, you can eventually wield all these secondary weapons on all classes. You're also given a dodge, a melee attack, and grenades. The gunplay itself is incredibly solid. The different guns feel satisfying, and there's some great secondary weapon variety as well. So Deadlink, off the bat, starts off strong right there. The game feels very much like a movement or hero shooter, and one of the 2 class abilities for each hero is a movement ability or engage ability of some kind. The starter class, Soldier, gets a grappling hook that attaches to enemies or powerball orbs and pulls you towards them. The Hunter class swaps places with the enemy unit, while the Engineer class gets a massive movement speed boost when you use that ability. All of these abilities combine with the dash and some nice moderate verticality on the maps to create a fun core gameplay loop where you're constantly moving, jumping around, it's just zooming around the arena. Enemies are also speedy and will jump out to attack you pretty quickly. This, combined with that movement, makes Deadlink very fast-paced. To take things a step further, enemies can be marked by using your abilities on them. Marking enemies increases damage they take, but more importantly, it also makes them drop a shield after you kill them. And that's your main way to regenerate shields until you get some progression upgrades that we'll talk about later on. All these together give the game a very similar feel to modern Doom games, like Doom Eternal for example. You're constantly in the face of enemies, needing to mark them, kill enemies to heal up, and sometimes enemies also have specific mechanics that require melee specifically. It's a very in-your-face FPS game, and it's not the type of game that will allow for sniper builds like Gunfire Reborn might, for example. You can never stop moving because you'll die very quickly while standing still. I wouldn't say it's a super hard game, but it's definitely a punishing one. Overall, I think Deadlink succeeds in creating that vibe and gameplay that it strives for. That core FPS gameplay, that movement shooter focus of Deadlink is just really good, and it feels really satisfying to get good at it. And that core gameplay is undoubtedly the selling point of Deadlink for me. In terms of game structure, Deadlink has a very familiar one. The game is split into 4 areas, and in the first 3, you clear rooms of enemies before selecting a reward out of a set of options, and moving on to the next area before you get to the final boss. These rewards are what you use to make up your build. Deadlink has a very unique build crafting system, and I don't think I've seen anything quite like it before. There are 2 broad categories, more standard roguelite upgrades, and the less standard implant or module upgrades. In the more standard category are the buffs to your weapon, like increased reload speed, and various buffs to your class abilities. These class abilities can be pretty fun, like ones that recharge your grapple when you kill an enemy that you just grappled to. These standard choices are generally fine, but they're also more limited in terms of number of possibilities, actual variety of upgrades. The more unique build crafting mechanic comes in the form of chips or implants. Each character has 4 slots to add chips or implants, and these implants can have active and passive effects. The active effects of an implant are activated when the conditions for that row are met, either changing weapons, using one of the 2 class abilities, or destroying a power ball found throughout the map. There's also a basic tier system that limits which chips can be placed in which rows. Conceptually, I really liked this system. It was nice to choose when and where you wanted certain effects to trigger. For example, you could have one implant give increased melee damage after you used a grappling hook, which was fun because you could pull yourself to enemies and now deal heavy melee damage. There are also some decent synergies, mostly on the 3 elemental types and their respective condition effects. Each elemental type damage increases damage to a corresponding health type, but the build crafting system made it feel more optimal to focus on one elemental type on a given run, as opposed to spreading it out. While I liked some parts and the general structure of this build crafting system, something just feels missing or lacking. It's really hard for me to pinpoint exactly what that is though. I think ultimately it comes down to the fact that, with few exceptions, builds just don't really change how you play, and that made the builds feel pretty forgettable. The main exception to that rule comes in the form of class skill upgrades, like the ones that make grapples recharge faster, leading to more grappling hooks as I got speedy kills. But otherwise, I would mostly just play exactly the same. I don't really feel like I have memorable builds in Deadlink as I could say about Gunfire Reborn, for example, or really a lot of other roguelites. So yeah, I found the build crafting to be novel, it was interesting in some ways, but it just didn't feel like there was a rewarding payoff for making a good build. And I'm struggling to think of notable builds that I had across all of my runs. Wrapping up on gameplay, a small pet peeve that I have with this game. There's an annoying high-pitched pinging sound whenever a dodge recharges. Obviously, this is to indicate that you can dodge again, but you're also dodging all the time, which means that you have this pinging noise happening also all the time. I found this really annoying, and I thought it was a random ambient sound at first before I realized what was actually happening. I wish I could turn this off, but I checked and you can't. Again, more of a pet peeve, not an actual deal breaker. I did also try this game on Steam Deck. It does run, the controls are all fine, but I didn't love playing this game on Steam Deck from a performance perspective. You don't really have great frame rate, the fast-paced nature of it made those low frames combined with the small screen just not feel as good to play. But again, it is playable if that's your only device. Now let's talk about the variety and randomness in Deadlink, which is definitely the game's weakest point for me. The main source of RNG build-wise comes in the form of what id plants or modules you find, because there are 81 different options you can find along your runs. Some of them are better than others, and some of them synergize a lot better with others, and some of them just fit certain classes a lot better than others. As I said though, these implants usually don't make massive changes to how you actually play, but rather change how you deal damage or make other small buffs or modifiers. The more classic roguelike upgrades I talked about earlier can basically always be reliably gotten run to run, because you can always choose reward type, and each reward type has very few options. So if you try to get that reward type a couple times, you can always get the option that you want. The bigger source of run to run variety compared to your builds was actually what class or combat shell you played. I think the developers did a great job of making these classes feel different, and their different approaches to movement, fights, how they marked enemies for self-heal are all great. These distinct classes are another selling point of Deadlink to me, and it just goes back to how I think the developers nailed that core move-and shooter gameplay. That being said, some of these classes were definitely better at certain bosses than others, because of how easy it is for them to mark and kill enemies, and therefore how easy it is for you to self-heal on bosses. Probably the biggest disappointment of Deadlink for me was the poor run-to-run variety in regards to enemy types, map layout, and bosses. I actually think the different enemy types, and most of the bosses and mini-bosses, are well designed. Going into each area felt refreshing, and learning how to manage the different intricacies of the new and unique enemies was a fun challenge. But the overall cadence and structure of each run feels very similar. Each run will always have you encounter the same new enemy type on room 4 out of 9, and then the next enemy type on room 6 out of 9, things like that. It's very formulaic, it's quickly repetitive, and the final boss of each area is always the same with no variance. The funny thing is, the fourth area actually addresses some of these complaints. The structuring is very different, the ordering of the levels is different, and you can choose which rooms you want to clear for set rewards, or you can choose to fight the boss early with the debuff. There's some nice risk reward mechanics there, and some nice variety as well. Additionally, the rooms in this fourth area have unique mini-bosses that require unique mechanics to kill. And without specific spoilers, the final boss has some run-run variety. It has effectively some boss variants. I think it would be possible to add some of that variety into the rest of this game, maybe adding some boss variants to the other bosses, but it's not there right now. And I took a couple breaks from playing this game in part because I got bored of that repetitiveness of the first few areas, so I do think that's really holding this game back. Now let's talk about progression and replayability in Deadlink. Deadlink has some hefty progression, most of which is vertical progression that makes you more powerful. The first big unlock system comes in the form of unlocking different classes or combat shells. It's basically just getting to certain points along each run where you can unlock them, and one combat shell is unlocked in each area outside of the first area. This is obviously more horizontal progression focus, giving you some more playstyle variety, as I've already talked about, and that's pretty standard across roguelites. The other main progression system though comes in the form of a fairly straightforward skill tree with upgrades split into two types. More general upgrades that apply across all of your runs, and class or combat shell specific upgrades. Most of these upgrades are pure vertical progression. The general upgrades give more health, more damage, better upgrade tiers on future runs, better starting conditions, things like that. With only one or two exceptions, they don't add anything new in the way of new builds or new combos. They're just different types of buffs. The character-specific upgrades, on the other hand, are a little more interesting, and some of them will buff certain mechanics of each character. And other ones will unlock new character-specific upgrades that can be found on future runs. Again, just adding more variety. For example, a final tier upgrade for the engineer class allows you to drop a second turret with some drawbacks. This whole progression skill tree is mostly fine, but I just didn't love it. It's straightforward and it's functional, but it's not super interesting. And it had some weird design choices and reward placement. For example, there's no healing or shield regeneration between fights, even after boss fights and between areas, which felt a little weird. However, you can eventually unlock an upgrade that does recharge some shield, and that makes the game feel so much better to play. But it took me 5 or 6 hours to unlock that. There are a couple upgrades like this where it feels worse to not have them than it feels good or fun to finally unlock them. It felt like a couple of these should have had a basic tier unlocked from the start. Also, within each run, there are frequent reward choices between within run power-ups, like another implant, or collecting experience and tokens, the two cross-run currencies. I always hate being forced to make that choice, being forced to choose between cross-run progression or within-run fun. It's a pet peeve of mine, so again, I just hate seeing it. So as you can see, different things here and there make Deadlink's progression unsatisfying to me. But at the same time, there's nothing especially offensive about it. It's ultimately just a standard, fine progression system. The game does have 3 total difficulty levels you unlock as you play more, and these do speed up your progression as well, help with that pacing a little bit. I can still only beat the game with one class, so I didn't play around with these that much. There's also an endless mode, but similarly, I don't typically enjoy endless modes in games, so I didn't try it out that much. As a smaller thing, there's also a collection log or codex that tracks if you've used every implant along your runs, as well as having various lore entries. And on that note, let's talk about the narrative and story in Deadlink. Deadlink has some nice world building and a cool cyberpunk world. Each of the 4 areas in this game are a different cyberpunk corporation run amok. As you unlock each area, you get lore about the company, the employees, things like that, via lore entries in a menu and through voice-acted dialogue from the couple NPCs that are in your home base or that you encounter along your runs. It's a decent amount of lore actually, and it has some nice voice acting, but they do also repeat their lines pretty frequently after you played for a little bit. I did like this story and world as a whole. I also like some of the twists and how the story intersected with the final boss. But I also don't feel like the story really paid off at any point. There are some cutscenes for beating runs, but they've been underwhelming so far, though I haven't watched the last couple ones yet. It felt like a lot of lore and world building that didn't really go anywhere, which makes sense because it's hard to have a story endpoint in roguelites where that gameplay depends on there not being an endpoint. So overall, it's good world building, but it doesn't necessarily translate into an actual good story. So what's my verdict on Deadlink? I think Deadlink has arguably the best FPS gameplay that I've seen in a roguelite, and it's certainly the best movement or hero shooter gameplay that I've seen in the genre. The different classes feel great to learn and master. I'm more lukewarm on the build crafting system, which has some novel ideas and mechanics, but struggles to create truly game-changing or run-changing builds. And while the enemy design overall is great, the run-to-run variety in terms of enemies, game structure, bosses, and things like that was disappointing and got repetitive. Similarly, the progression had some nice elements, but also some design choices that I didn't really vibe with. Would I still recommend this game? If you're a big FPS fan, either for movement shooters like Overwatch or fast-paced arena shooters like Doom Eternal, then I think Deadlink can still be worth picking up. That core gameplay is just so solid and fun. It does everything else well enough, and there's some nice extra elements like the world building and lore. But that lack of satisfying build crafting, the lack of enemy variety or run-to-run variation on that end, and some of those other frustration points limited that replayability for me. And I suspect those elements will be a deal breaker for a lot of other players as well if you're not carried by that strong core FPS gameplay. Huge shout out to all of our channel members for helping support the channel. Please like this video to help me out in the algorithm, and thanks for watching.